Tonight, this war looks bigger than a normal exchange of strikes. Because what is unfolding now is no longer only about missiles hitting military targets or retaliatory attacks across borders. The real danger is that the conflict is moving toward the systems that keep the region alive: oil routes, gas infrastructure, shipping lanes, and the military bases meant to protect them. And once a war reaches that level, the consequences stop being local. They begin to spread across markets, alliances, and economies far beyond the battlefield. That is why this moment matters. The center of gravity in this conflict is shifting. At the beginning, the focus was on direct strikes, leadership losses, military retaliation, and the question of who could hit harder. But now, a more dangerous pattern is emerging. The war is pressing against the Strait of Hormuz, against major energy assets, against regional military facilities, and against the fragile confidence that global trade depends on. This is where a regional war starts becoming an international economic threat. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another narrow waterway on the map. It is one of the most important energy choke points on Earth. A huge share of the world's oil and gas trade passes through it. If traffic through that corridor becomes too risky, too expensive, or too slow, the impact is felt almost immediately. Oil prices react. Shipping costs rise. Insurance premiums jump. Governments begin emergency consultations. And countries far away from the fighting suddenly find themselves paying the price for a war they are not even part of. That is exactly why this phase of the conflict is so serious. What we are seeing now is a war that is no longer confined to direct battlefield exchange. It is spreading outward into the strategic skeleton of the region. Energy fields, export routes, refineries, ports, air bases, radar networks, and shipping lanes are all becoming part of the wider pressure campaign. And that change is the meaning of escalation. Because when a war starts threatening energy flow, it is no longer only about destruction. It is about leverage. The message becomes very clear: if one side cannot stop pressure through conventional means alone, it can still raise the cost of war by threatening the region's economic arteries. That does not require a full regional invasion. It does not require permanent occupation. It only requires enough pressure, enough uncertainty, and enough disruption to force everyone else to feel the heat. That is why the energy angle is now central. One of the most dangerous developments in any modern conflict is when infrastructure becomes a target class of its own. Once gas facilities, export terminals, and industrial hubs come under threat, the battlefield widens instantly. A missile strike is no longer only a military event. It becomes a market event, a diplomatic event, an alliance event, and sometimes even a domestic political event in countries thousands of miles away. That is what makes this war so volatile now. The fear is not only what has already happened. The fear is what could happen if this pattern continues. If major energy infrastructure across the Gulf remains under pressure, the entire region moves into a new level of insecurity. Gulf states may not want to become central actors in this war, but geography may not give them that choice. If they host key facilities, strategic export hubs, or foreign military assets, they become exposed whether they seek confrontation or not. And that creates a second problem. Can regional partner states remain politically outside the core war while becoming operationally entangled in it? That question is becoming harder to answer. Because in a conflict like this, neutrality becomes fragile. A country does not need to declare war to feel the impact of escalation. It only needs to sit near critical infrastructure, host strategic facilities, or serve as a logistical node for Allied operations. Once that happens, distance from the war becomes largely symbolic. In practice, the pressure arrives anyway. This is why the conflict is no longer just testing firepower. It is testing regional architecture. It is testing whether alliances can hold under pressure. It is testing whether maritime security can be preserved. It is testing whether energy exports can continue normally. And it is testing whether the United States and its partners can reassure the region that their security systems still function when the war begins spreading across a wider map. That brings us to another critical front in this conflict: air defense. Because one of the most important realities in modern warfare is not simply whether air defenses work or fail in a single engagement. The deeper question is whether they can keep working over time, under stress, across a large area, against repeated attacks. That is a much harder test. Modern defensive systems are expensive. Interceptors cost money. Radar networks are high-value assets. Constant readiness strains personnel and logistics. Meanwhile, the attacking side often uses cheaper platforms to force costly defensive responses. Even when the defense succeeds, the exchange can still work in favor of the attacker by draining resources, stretching deployment lines, and creating new vulnerabilities. That is the ugly mathematics of this war. One side does not need to destroy everything to change the balance. Sometimes it only needs to make defense more expensive than offense. Sometimes it only needs to force its opponent to protect too many sites at once: cities, bases, oil facilities, ports, shipping routes, and industrial infrastructure. Once that happens, the battlefield becomes too wide, and the cost of maintaining control rises with every passing day. That is why this conflict is increasingly about endurance, not just retaliation. Who can sustain the pressure? Who can protect more targets for longer? Who can keep supply lines open? Who can prevent markets from panicking? Who can convince allies that the situation is still under control? Those questions now matter just as much as the question of who launched the bigger strike. And this is where the war becomes strategically dangerous for everyone involved. For Iran, the message is that pressure can be redirected beyond the immediate battlefield. If direct confrontation is costly, then pressure can be applied through energy risk, maritime insecurity, and regional fear. For Israel, the challenge is no longer only to strike effectively, but to avoid triggering a spiral that draws more actors into the conflict. For the United States, the challenge is even broader. It is not only about military action. It is about proving that its regional security umbrella still has credibility when the pressure spreads across several countries and several types of targets at once. And for Gulf states, the challenge may be the most uncomfortable of all. They may not want full entry into this war. But if their airspace, energy infrastructure, ports, or military partnerships are dragged deeper into the crisis, they may find that they are no longer observers. They become stakeholders under pressure. And once that line is crossed, every decision becomes harder: how much support to give, how much distance to keep, how to protect infrastructure, and how to avoid becoming the next pressure point. This is also why international debate around the crisis matters. Once shipping lanes and energy routes become vulnerable, outside powers cannot afford to ignore the situation. Some will push for stronger maritime protection. Some will call for burden sharing. Some will hesitate, fearing a deeper entanglement. And that hesitation itself becomes part of the problem, because uncertainty encourages further pressure. That is how wars expand without formal declarations. No. Always through dramatic announcements, but through creeping exposure. A vessel is struck. A shipping route becomes less secure. A refinery or gas facility feels vulnerable. A military base raises its alert level. Insurance costs go up. Markets react. Diplomats start holding emergency calls. Allies begin asking who will do what if the pressure intensifies. And before long, the war has widened even if the map has not officially changed. That is the stage this conflict appears to be entering now. And that is why the most important development may not be the next televised explosion. It may be the slow militarization of the region's connective tissue, the routes, systems, and infrastructure that allow economies to function and alliances to project confidence. Because visible destruction is only one form of damage. Strategic disruption can be even more powerful. A damaged building can be rebuilt. A strike site can be cleared. But uncertainty is much harder to repair. When shipowners become nervous, when insurers raise rates, when governments fear supply disruption, and when investors begin pricing in long-term instability, the conflict starts generating consequences that cannot be contained by air defenses alone. That is why the world is watching this phase so closely. If the pressure around the Strait of Hormuz continues, then this war could move into a new chapter defined less by territorial control and more by economic coercion. If energy-linked sites remain vulnerable, then the strategic cost of every new strike increases. If regional defense networks continue facing sustained stress, then the perception of security begins to erode even where formal alliances remain intact. And perception matters in war. A region can be materially strong and still strategically shaken if too many actors begin doubting whether critical systems can be protected at acceptable cost. Once that doubt spreads, deterrence weakens. And when deterrence weakens, escalation becomes easier. So where does this go next? If current trends continue, the next phase may include greater pressure on maritime traffic, sharper concern over export infrastructure, more allied coordination, more debate over burden sharing, and a more intense contest over whether the war can be contained before it spills further across the Gulf. Even without a formal all-out regional war, the strategic effects could keep widening. That is the key point. This conflict no longer needs to expand in the traditional sense to become more dangerous. It only needs to keep raising the cost of normal life around the energy heart of the Middle East. It only needs to keep making the region's arteries feel exposed. And it only needs to keep forcing governments to respond to uncertainty faster than they can reduce it. That is why this is no longer just a story of missiles and retaliate. It is a story about whether the war is moving into the foundations of regional order itself. Because once shipping lanes, energy assets, and partner states all begin to feel the pressure at the same time, the question changes. It is no longer just who can strike harder. It becomes who can absorb more pressure, protect more systems, reassure more allies, and stop the conflict from turning the Gulf's economic map into a battlefield. And if that line is not held, then this war will not remain a regional crisis for long. It will become a global shock felt far beyond the front lines.